The emergency session had been in progress for 11 hours when the human seat was still empty. Delegate Yaron Shal of the Vorathi hegemony noted the absence for the third time, his elongated jaw twitching in what passed for satisfaction among his kind. He swept one four-fingered hand across the curved surface of the voting console embedded in the armrest of his tiered seat, confirming what the tally projection already showed in cold cyan numerals above the chamber floor. 612 in favor of condemnation, 109 opposed, 41 abstaining. The motion to classify Earth as a Category 1 aggressor state, stripping its trade rights, freezing its colonial charters, and authorizing preemptive military containment, would pass within the hour. The Terran delegation had been notified 9 days ago. They had sent no representative. 3 tiers below Yaron, in the wide semicircular pit that served as the speaking floor of the Sovereign Compact Assembly, Arbiter Velis Koth stood behind the raised lectern of black glass, her silver-white ceremonial mantle pooling around her feet. She was Kalenthi, tall, narrow-shouldered, her skin the color of storm clouds, her eyes large and unblinking with horizontal pupils that tracked across the chamber like a raptor surveying a field. She had presided over the assembly for 42 standard cycles. She had never lost a quorum vote to a procedural challenge in all that time. The chamber itself was a monument to collective ambition. 9 ascending tiers of polished pale stone curved in a full amphitheater embrace around the speaking floor, each tier fitted with brushed steel armrests and individual voting consoles that glowed faintly cyan. The glass dome overhead, a vast hemisphere of interlocking crystal panels reinforced with latticed alloy, revealed a pale lavender sky streaked with the contrails of patrol corvettes. Holographic displays lined the curved walls between fluted columns, cycling through agenda items in alien script. 662 delegates from 41 member species filled the tiers, their varied anatomies, elongated skulls, multiple limbs, luminous skin, chitinous plates, creating a living mosaic of galactic governance. The delegations have heard the evidence compiled by the Joint Security Directorate, Velis said, her voice carrying through the acoustic architecture without amplification. 309 verified incidents of Terran military deployment beyond their sanctioned corridors. 47 unauthorized weapons tests in neutral systems. The refusal to submit to scheduled inspections at Outpost Karena for 6 consecutive review periods. She paused. She was good at pauses. The chamber held its collective breath on her timing. The Terran seat remains empty, Velis continued. Per Article 12 of the Assembly Charter, an absent delegation forfeits its right to contest the motion on the floor. We will proceed to the binding vote. A murmur rippled through the upper tiers. It was not surprise, it was confirmation. The Vorathi contingent, 12 delegates in dark crimson robes with burnished bronze clasps, leaned forward together, their elongated skulls catching the pale daylight from the dome. They had authored the condemnation resolution. They had spent 4 years gathering the evidence, cultivating the votes, and ensuring the Terran delegation would receive its summons too late to mount an effective response. Yaron Shal knew this because he had overseen the timing personally. The notification had been routed through a diplomatic relay station on the far edge of the Kalenthi corridor, adding 3 days of transit delay. By the time the Terran Foreign Affairs Office received the formal summons, the evidentiary hearings had already concluded. By the time they could assemble a delegation, brief them, and dispatch a vessel to the assembly station, the vote would be over. It was elegant, it was procedurally legal, and it was, Yaron reflected, exactly the kind of maneuvering the humans had been too inexperienced to anticipate. The preliminary tally had been locked in for 2 days. The Vorathi had secured commitments from 17 delegations through a series of bilateral meetings held in the station's private conference suites, meetings where concerns were addressed, trade considerations were discussed, and the general understanding was established that the Vorathi hegemony would remember which delegations had supported the resolution and which had not. No threats were made. None needed to be. The Vorathi controlled 3 of the Compact's 8 primary shipping corridors. A delegation that voted against the resolution would not face retaliation. It would simply find its trade convoys experiencing longer processing times at Vorathi-administered transit points. The evidence package, 309 deployments, 47 weapons tests, 6 inspection refusals, was comprehensive, well-documented, and entirely factual. Every number was accurate. The framing had been the art. A deployment in response to a distress signal became an unauthorized military incursion when you removed the distress signal from the report. A weapons test conducted with advance notification became an unauthorized test when you omitted the notification. The facts were real, the context was absent, and the difference between a fact and the truth was exactly wide enough to condemn a species. On the tier reserved for the Thessari Concordance, 9 delegates with pale, almost translucent skin sat in silent formation. Their senior representative, a tall figure named Kale Dorath, had voted in favor of condemnation without comment during the preliminary round. The Thessari were pragmatists. They followed evidence. They had reviewed the Directorate's summary and found it thorough. They had not cross-referenced it against the Compact's own databases, because the Directorate was a trusted institution, and trusted institutions did not require verification. That was the assumption. That was the foundation on which 612 votes rested. On the opposite tier, the Macquarie delegation, 7 delegates with broad, flat faces and dense, mottled gray skin, had split their vote. 5 in favor, 2 abstaining. The abstentions were unusual for the Macquarie, who tended to vote as a bloc. One of the dissenters, a delegate named Rosha Ken, had served on the Inspection Oversight Committee 2 decades earlier. She had said nothing during the proceedings, but her silence had a particular quality. The silence of someone who remembered how inspections were supposed to work and recognized something wrong in how these had been conducted. Below them, the Oranchi Compact held a small cluster of seats near the speaking floor. Their delegation was only 4 members, a minor faction, lightly regarded, with limited voting weight. But their senior delegate, a short woman named Sivi with blue-green skin mottled with chromatophore patterns that shifted in real time, had been visibly agitated throughout the proceedings. Her opposition vote had been noted and ignored. Minor factions opposed things. That was what minor factions did. On the far curve of Tier 6, the Valenthi delegation sat in 2 rows. They were among the oldest species in the Compact, long-lived, deep-memoried with amber eyes and weathered faces that carried generations of institutional memory in their bone structure. Their senior delegate, an elder named Torin Vale, had voted in favor of condemnation. He had done so reluctantly, and the reluctance had been visible to anyone who knew how to read Valenthi body language. A slight downward cast of the eyes, a positioning of the hands that in Valenthi culture signaled deference to group judgment over personal conviction. Below him, on Tier 4, the Drosh delegation occupied a wide section of reinforced seating. They were a larger species, with chitinous plates covering their upper bodies and multifaceted eyes that processed visual information across spectrums invisible to most other delegates. 14 Drosh delegates sat in rigid formation, their mandibles clicking softly in the subsonic range. They had voted in favor because the Vorathi trade corridors were essential to their colonial supply lines. Pragmatism, not conviction. Arbiter, Sivi of the Oranchi said, rising from her seat. Her chromatophores cycled through distress patterns, sharp contrasts of indigo and gold that rippled across her face and throat. I must note for the record that the Terran delegation's absence does not necessarily indicate acceptance of the charges. The transit time from the nearest Terran consulate to this station is noted, Velis said, and insufficient to alter Article 12. The binding vote will commence in The doors opened. Not the small delegate entrances on the lower tiers, which cycled constantly as representatives moved between the chamber and the corridor consultation rooms. The main doors. The formal entry at the far end of the central aisle. 2 slabs of brushed titanium alloy, each 4 meters tall, designed to frame arriving dignitaries against the light of the corridor beyond. They opened, and a single figure walked through. She was not what the chamber expected. Lena Vasic was 53 years old. She had gray-streaked dark hair pulled back tight, deep lines at the corners of her mouth, and the particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates not from hours without sleep, but from years of being in rooms where the outcome was already decided before she arrived. She wore a dark navy diplomatic coat, no insignia, no rank tabs, no ornamental anything. Her shoes were flat. She carried nothing in her hands. No data tablet, no folder, no briefcase, no documentation. She walked the full length of the central aisle. The aisle was long, 40 meters from the main doors to the speaking floor, and she covered it at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, with the steady gait of someone who understood that the walk itself was part of the statement. Her footsteps were the only sound in a chamber designed to amplify the voices of species that spoke at frequencies humans could barely hear. Every delegate on every tier turned to watch. The collective attention of 662 alien officials settled on her like a physical weight, and she carried it the way she carried everything. Without acknowledgement, without resistance, with the practiced endurance of a woman who had been the only human in alien rooms since before some of the junior delegates had been born. She stopped at the edge of the pit, 3 meters from Arbiter Velis Koth's lectern. "You are," Velis said. "Lena Vasic," she said, "Senior Diplomatic Envoy, Terran Consular Service. I hold speaking rights under Section 4 of the Assembly Charter as a duly appointed representative of a member state." Velis's horizontal pupils contracted. The Terran seat has been recorded as absent for the duration of these proceedings. Under Article 12. Article 12 applies to the contestation of motions already voted upon, Lena said. Her voice was level, not loud, not aggressive, the kind of voice that had been trained to carry weight without volume. "The binding vote has not yet been called. I arrived before the vote. I am requesting recognized speaking time under Section 4, which grants any member state representative the right to address the Assembly prior to a binding vote, provided they are physically present in the chamber." In the upper tiers, Yaron Shaw felt something cold settle in his stomach. He pulled up the charter text on his console. His eyes moved fast. Section 4 was there. It had always been there. It was a legacy provision from the Compact's founding era, rarely invoked, because no delegation in the Assembly's history had ever needed to invoke it. Delegations were always present, always briefed, always ready. It existed for exactly this kind of scenario, a delegation arriving late under duress, requesting the floor before a vote closed. It had never been tested against an Article 12 absence ruling. Yaron stood. His crimson robes shifted around him as he gripped the railing of his tier. Arbiter, the Terran delegation, was formally notified 9 days ago. They chose not to attend the evidentiary hearings. The proceedings have concluded. Granting speaking time at this stage would undermine the procedural integrity of everything this body has. Would be consistent with Section 4, Velis said. She did not look up at him. She was reading her own console, her gray fingers moving across the charter text. 42 cycles of presiding had given her an instinct for procedural fairness that operated independent of political convenience. Section 4 does not require attendance at prior proceedings. It requires physical presence before the binding vote. She looked at Lena Vasic. "You have the floor, Delegate Vasic. Standard speaking allocation, 30 minutes. "I will need 7, Lena said. Another ripple through the tiers, audible this time, a compound sound of shifting bodies, exhaled breaths, the soft clicking of Drosh mandibles and the rustling of Vorathi robes. Delegates exchanged glances. Sivi of the Oranchi sat back down slowly, her chromatophores shifting from distress to cautious attention. On the Thessari tier, Kale Doreth's translucent skin showed a faint pulse of color beneath the surface. The involuntary response his species produced when encountering something that did not fit expectations. 7 minutes. Standard speaking allocations were 30 minutes, and most delegates used every second, often requesting extensions. The Vorathi senior address had lasted 94 minutes. The Directorate's evidence presentation had taken 4 hours. The combined proceedings had consumed 11 hours of chamber time. 7 minutes said, "I do not need your time, I need your attention." Lena Vasic did not move to the lectern. She stayed where she was, standing in the open pit, visible from every tier, the dome's pale daylight falling on her from above. The light caught the gray streaks in her hair and the lines at the corners of her mouth and the dark navy of her coat, and it made her look exactly like what she was. A 53-year-old woman who had traveled across half the galaxy to stand in a room where she was not welcome and say something that could not be said from anywhere else. "I have not come to contest the evidence," she said. The chamber stiffened. On the upper tiers, Yaren Shah leaned forward. On the Thessari tier, Kale Doreth's hand stilled on his console. On the Valenthi tier, Torin Vale raised his amber eyes from a data tablet he had been pretending to read. The statement made no sense. The entire purpose of speaking before a condemnation vote was to contest the evidence. The 309 deployments cited by the Joint Security Directorate are accurate, Lena continued. The 47 weapons tests are accurate. The refusal to submit to inspection at Outpost Karena is accurate. She paused, not for effect. She paused the way someone pauses when they are deciding how much truth a room can hold. Every one of those deployments was a response to a distress signal from a non-Terran vessel or station. The words hit the chamber at the speed of comprehension, which is slower than the speed of sound but far more destructive. On 3 separate tiers, delegates simultaneously reached for their consoles. The Emergency Response Registry was a public database maintained by the Assembly's own administrative staff. It was searchable. It was time-stamped. And it had been there untouched for the entire duration of the 11-hour proceedings. Everyone was logged with the Compact's own Emergency Response Registry, Lena said. The weapons tests were conducted in uninhabited systems with advanced notification filed through standard channels. And the inspections at Karena were declined because the inspection team included personnel from a state that had an active territorial claim against the facility being inspected. A conflict of interest that was raised formally 3 times and dismissed without review. She let that settle. On the middle tiers, the soft blue glow of data screens flickered across dozens of faces as delegates began pulling up records. The registry interface loaded. The deployment logs populated. The timestamps aligned. "Those details are in the Compact's own records," Lena said. "They were not included in the Joint Security Directorate's summary. I am not alleging conspiracy. I am alleging that the evidence was curated, that the facts which supported condemnation were presented, and the facts which provided context were omitted." She stopped, drew a single breath of the thin, cold air. "This is not a legal argument. It is a description of what happened." Yaren Shah's jaw tightened. He could feel the attention in the chamber shifting, not a sudden break but a deep structural reorientation, the way a current changes when the bottom of a river shifts. The deployment logs were cross-referencing against the Emergency Response Registry on dozens of consoles simultaneously. The data was matching. The distress signals were real hull breaches, drive failures, medical emergencies, pirate interdictions in unpatrolled corridors. 309 calls for help, answered. 309 responses, logged by the Assembly's own systems. 309 facts that had been in the record all along, unchecked by the body that had used them as evidence of aggression. On the Macquarie tier, Rosha Ken, the former Inspection Oversight Committee member who had abstained, opened her console and began pulling inspection composition records from the archive. Her broad, flat face showed nothing, but her fingers moved with the speed of someone confirming something she had suspected for weeks. Lena Vasic continued, "I did not come here to argue that Earth is innocent. We are not innocent. We are a young species in an old system, and we have made mistakes, tactical errors, diplomatic failures, moments of arrogance that cost us trust we had not yet earned. I do not dispute that." Her voice did not change. It maintained the same controlled, even register, the voice of someone who had accepted the situation and was simply describing it with precision. "What I came here to do," she said, "is ask this body a question." The chamber waited. 662 faces, elongated, angular, broad, translucent, mottled, turned toward a single human standing on a speaking floor calibrated for species twice her height. Not a rhetorical question, a real one that requires an honest answer from every delegate in this room. She turned slowly, looking up at the tiers. Not scanning, meeting eyes. Holding gazes one at a time, tier by tier, species by species, the Vorathi in their crimson, the Kalinthi arbiters in their silver, the Oranchi in their gray, the Thessari, the Macquarie, the Valenthi, the Drosh, 41 species arranged in ascending curves of stone and steel beneath a dome that showed a sky they controlled. "Why did you build this?" Lena said. A beat of confusion rippled through the upper tiers. "This assembly," she said, "this chamber, this institution, why does the sovereign compact exist?" Yaren Shal exhaled through his nostrils, a philosophical question, the last refuge of a losing position. But Lena was not finished. "It exists because 470 years ago, the Valentha-Macquarie War killed 11 billion people across 6 systems, and the survivors decided that collective governance, even imperfect, even slow, even maddening, was preferable to the alternative." On the Valenthi tier, Torin Vale lowered his console. His amber eyes, deep set in a weathered face that had seen more cycles than most species lived, went still. He was old enough to carry the memory of grandparents who had survived that war, old enough to know what 11 billion meant not as a number, but as an absence, a silence that lasted generations, a demographic scar that his species would carry for centuries. Several other Valenthi delegates did the same. Their consoles went dark one by one, like lights extinguishing down a corridor. On the Macquarie tier across the chamber, the effect was mirrored. The Macquarie had lost 6 billion of those 11. Their cultural memory ran deep, carried in genealogical chants that named the dead. 2 of the delegates who had voted in favor, younger members, born long after the Reconstruction, glanced at their elders. The elders did not glance back. They were looking at the human woman on the speaking floor. "That is the founding premise," Lena said. "That is the Charter's first clause, not security, not trade, not military coordination. The prevention of the next war that kills 11 billion people." She let the silence work. It was not a theatrical silence. It was the silence of a room full of officials remembering something they knew and had stopped thinking about. The way anyone stops thinking about the foundation of the building they work in. Because the foundation is invisible and the work is immediate, and the weight of daily procedure buries the reason the procedure exists. "Every institution drifts," she said. "Every governing body over time begins to confuse the machinery of governance with its purpose. The procedures become the point. The votes become the point. The evidence summaries, the quorum counts, the scheduling of sessions, all of it becomes the work, and the reason the work exists gets buried under the weight of doing it." She looked at Velas Koth, not accusingly, not angrily. With the exhausted clarity of someone stating an obvious truth that nobody had bothered to say aloud. This body was built to prevent the powerful from destroying the weak without consequence. That is its purpose. And today, this body is being used to do exactly what it was built to prevent. The silence that followed was not parliamentary silence, the tactical quiet of delegates calculating their next move. It was deeper. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that settles over a room when something true has been said that everyone has known and no one has spoken. On the Thessari tier, Kale Dorath had pulled up the records of the 12 joint military exercises his own government had conducted with Terran forces. The invitations were there, signed by the Thessari Defense Ministry, filed through official channels, with Thessari observers present at every test site. 12 of the 47 unauthorized weapons tests had been conducted at Thessari invitation. His delegation had voted in favor of condemnation. He had reviewed the directorate's summary. He had not cross-referenced it. He had trusted the source. He looked at the invitation records on his screen, and the color beneath his translucent skin deepened. The involuntary flush his species produced in response to factual shame, visible to every delegate on the neighboring tiers as clearly as if he had spoken the word aloud. On the Drosh tier, mandibles clicked in rapid subsonic patterns, the sound of 14 minds processing new data simultaneously, each multifaceted eye reflecting the cyan glow of consoles showing deployment logs, registry entries, timestamp comparisons. Lena spoke again. I am not asking you to absolve Earth. I am asking you to look at the mechanism being used against us and recognize it. She let each word carry its weight. A curated evidence package, a delayed notification, a vote called before the accused could arrive to speak. These are not the tools of justice. These are the tools of the powerful removing an inconvenience. Yaron Shal stood. His voice cut across the tiers, louder now, carrying the edge of a delegate who could feel his coalition shifting beneath him. Arbiter, the delegate is questioning the integrity of the proceedings. This is not a speaking time matter. This is a procedural challenge, and it requires formal filing through the... The delegate has the floor, Velis said. Her voice was steady, but something had shifted behind her eyes, the horizontal pupils moving not in their usual calculating pattern, but in the slow, careful rhythm of a Kalenthi mind, revising a conclusion it had held for weeks. Lena turned back to the full chamber. 309 times, she said. 309 times, a Terran vessel responded to a distress signal from a non-Terran ship, station, or colony. Medical emergencies, hull breaches, drive failures in unpatrolled corridors, pirate interdictions, radiation events. She held the count like a weight. Not because we were ordered to, not because it benefited us strategically, because the signal came and we were close, and the alternative was to let someone die in the dark. On the orangey tier, Sivi sat completely still. Her chromatophores had shifted to a color the chamber had never seen from her species during formal proceedings, a slow, deep violet that spread from her throat to her temples and remained. It was the color of an orangey processing something that had moved from the register of institutional knowledge into the register of conscience. Those deployments are the basis of the condemnation motion, Lena said. 309 acts of assistance, reframed as 309 acts of unauthorized military aggression. That is the evidence summary this body accepted without question. She was not raising her voice. She had not raised her voice once. The effect was devastating precisely because it was not performed. It was factual. It was specific. It was the kind of truth that dismantles not by force but by precision, each sentence a bolt removed from a structure that had looked solid from the outside and was now showing the gaps in its engineering. The 47 weapons tests, she continued. 12 of them were joint exercises conducted at the invitation of the Thessari Defense Ministry, with Thessari observers present. The records of those invitations are in the Thessari delegation's own archives. They were not included in the directorate's summary. On the Thessari tier, 9 heads turned in unison toward Kael Dorath. He said nothing. His silence was confirmation, and every delegate on the neighboring tiers could see it through his skin, the deepening color that his species could not hide and would not lie about. The remaining 35 tests were conducted in uninhabited systems, with notifications filed through the standard channel, Lena said. The notifications are time-stamped. They are in the registry. She let the implication complete itself. Nobody checked, nobody looked. The evidence was accepted because the source was trusted, and the conclusion was convenient, and the accused was not in the room. Outpost Karena, she said. 6 consecutive inspection refusals. That is the most damaging item in the evidence summary because it looks like concealment. It looks like a state hiding something behind closed doors. She looked directly at the Vorathi delegation, at Yaren Shal. The inspection team for all 6 scheduled reviews included personnel from the Vorathi hegemony, she said. The Vorathi hegemony filed a territorial reclamation claim against the Karena system 14 years ago. That claim is still active, unresolved, pending adjudication by this assembly's own Territorial Disputes Board. She paused. The inclusion of Vorathi personnel in an inspection of a facility located in the system they are actively claiming creates a direct conflict of interest under the Compact's own neutrality protocols. Section 31, Subsection 4, Paragraph 8. On the Makari tier, Rosha Ken leaned back in her seat. She had found the inspection composition records. They confirmed exactly what the human delegate had said. The Vorathi personnel assignments were there. The conflict of interest objections were there, 3 of them, filed formally, time-stamped, dismissed without stated cause. She had served on the oversight committee. She knew what proper inspection composition looked like. And she knew, with the specific, cold certainty of a professional recognizing a procedural violation in her own field, that these inspections had been compromised from the start. We raised this objection 3 times, Lena said, once in writing to the directorate, twice in formal session with the Inspection Oversight Committee. All 3 objections were dismissed without stated cause. The dismissals are on record. The reasons are not because no reasons were stated. She did not say fraud. She did not say sabotage. She did not say corruption. She let the architecture of the facts bear the weight and the architecture held. Yaren Shal sat down, not by choice. His legs made the decision, the involuntary response of a body recognizing that the ground beneath it had shifted. Around him, the Vorathi contingent was utterly still. 12 officials in crimson robes, 12 elongated jaws set rigid, 12 pairs of deep-set eyes fixed on the speaking floor. 3 tiers below, the drosh clicking intensified, the sharp, rapid pattern that was the drosh equivalent of alarm. On the speaking floor, Lena Vasic stood in the center of it all. One woman, 53 years old, no insignia, no data tablet, standing on alien stone, lit by alien daylight, surrounded by alien architecture. She had used 4 of her 7 minutes. "I have 3 minutes left," she said. "I will use them to say something that is not in the evidence, not in the charter, and not in any procedural filing." The chamber was absolutely still. "I have been a diplomat for 28 years. I have represented Earth in 11 different multilateral bodies. I have been lied to, threatened, patronized, and once physically removed from a chamber by security personnel who later apologized when they realized they had detained the wrong delegate." A faint sound from the lower tiers, something between a murmur and an exhalation. 2 delegates from minor factions exchanged glances. The kind of glances that said, "That has happened to us too." "I am not new to this work. I am not naive about how power operates in rooms like this one." She looked up at the dome. Through the glass, the patrol corvettes had shifted formation. Farther out, barely visible against the lavender sky, the running lights of a Terran frigate blinked in a slow, steady pattern, a vessel that had been there for days. Not threatening, not maneuvering, present. The way a witness stands at the back of a courtroom, not speaking, not intervening, but making it known that someone is watching. "What I have learned in 28 years," Lena said, "is that the most dangerous moment for any institution is not when it faces an external threat. It is when the people inside it stop asking themselves whether they are serving its purpose or using its machinery for their own." She brought her gaze back to the chamber, tier by tier, face by face. "This vote is not about Earth," she said. The statement landed like a change in barometric pressure, felt in the body before the mind processed it. Earth will survive condemnation. We will lose trade rights. We will lose colonial charters. We will be contained. We will be diminished. And we will continue responding to distress signals because that is what we do, and no vote in any chamber anywhere in this galaxy changes that. On the Valenthi tier, Torin Vale closed his console entirely. He was done calculating. He was listening now with something older than legislative interest, the attention of a species that remembered what it cost to need help and receive none. "This vote is about whether this assembly is still the institution its founders built," Lena said. "A place where the powerful are held to the same standard as the weak. A place where evidence is examined, not curated. A place where the accused is heard, not silenced by a transit delay." She drew one slow breath. The thin, cold air of the chamber, calibrated for Kalenthi physiology, uncomfortable for human lungs, filled her chest, and she used it. "Or whether this assembly has become the instrument its founders were trying to prevent." She stopped speaking. She did not say thank you. She did not bow. She did not make a closing statement or a dramatic exit. She simply stood there, hands at her sides, and waited. The silence lasted 11 seconds. In parliamentary time, 11 seconds is an age. It is long enough for 662 delegates to look at their consoles and see not the data but the absence of data, the context that was not provided, the records that were not checked, the objections that were filed and dismissed and forgotten. It is long enough for Torin Vale of the Valenthi to remember the chant his grandmother sang, 97 names, one for each member of her family killed in the orbital bombardment of Valenthi Prime. It is long enough for Rosha Ken of the Macari to finish reading the inspection composition records and close the file, her broad jaw set in the expression her colleagues knew meant someone had violated protocol in her field and would answer for it. It is long enough for the Drosh senior delegate to complete a full-spectrum visual analysis of every face in the chamber and confirm, through the compound data of 14 multifaceted eyes, that the physiological indicators of conviction were shifting across a statistical majority of the delegations present. 11 seconds, and in those 11 seconds the political architecture of the Sovereign Compact Assembly, 4 years of carefully maintained alliances, curated evidence, managed objections, and timed notifications began to come apart, not with a sound, with the absence of one. The absence of the murmur that normally filled every pause in these proceedings, the constant low hum of delegates conferring, calculating, positioning. That hum was gone. In its place was the silence of a room full of officials who had just been asked a question about themselves and were, for the first time in a very long time, considering the answer honestly. On Tier 7, a delegation from the Kelishari, a minor allied faction of the Vorathi bloc, quietly closed their voting consoles. They did not change their votes. They simply turned the screens off, the way someone turns off a light when they are no longer sure they want to see what it illuminates. On Tier 3, 2 delegates from the Oranchi began a low, rapid exchange. Not an argument, a recalibration. Sivi was nodding, her chromatophores still holding that deep violet, and her junior colleague was scrolling through the emergency response registry, with the speed of someone who needed to see the timestamps with her own eyes before she could believe what she had just heard. Arbiter Velis Koth looked at her console. She looked at the tally projection still glowing above the chamber floor, 612 in favor, 109 opposed, 41 abstaining. Numbers that had been locked for 2 days. Numbers that had felt like the only possible outcome an hour ago. She looked at Lena Vasic, standing alone on the speaking floor, and she thought about the dissertation she had written 46 years ago, 600 pages on the founding charter's first clause, the clause about preventing the next war that killed 11 billion. She had written it because she believed the clause was the most important sentence in galactic governance. She had spent 42 years presiding over an institution that had gradually stopped reading it. "The speaking allocation is concluded," Velis said. Her voice had changed, not in volume or pitch, in weight, in the specific gravity of a voice that is no longer performing authority but exercising it. "The binding vote will now commence. All delegates will register their final position." The chimes began. The first vote change came from the Thessari. Kale Doreth touched his console without looking at his colleagues, and the cyan tally shifted, 611. His delegation turned to him. He said one word in Thessari, roughly translated as confirmed, and 8 more consoles chimed in rapid succession. 603. The Oranchi followed. Not their votes, they had already opposed. But 3 delegations that had been abstaining shifted to opposition, their consoles chiming in quick succession. 597. On the Valenthi tier, Torin Vale voted against. His amber eyes did not move from the speaking floor where Lena Vasic stood. 3 Valenthi followed within seconds, then 2 more. Then the remaining 4, one after another, the cascade moving through the tier like a decision moving through a family. One person acts, and the rest recognize that the action is the one they had wanted to take, but had lacked the authority to begin. 581. On the Makari tier, the argument started. 2 delegates who had voted in favor were debating in sharp, rapid Makari while Rosha Ken sat between them, her inspection record still glowing on her console, saying nothing. A third delegate looked at the records on Rosha's screen, looked at his own console, and changed his vote. Then, a fourth. The argument ended when the 5th delegate said something in Makari that the universal translator rendered as "read the registry," and voted against. 568. The Relenthi, a small, scholarly faction from the inner system, switched in unison. All 6. They had voted in favor based on the directorate's summary. They had now read the emergency response registry. They did not deliberate. They did not confer. They read the data, and the data changed their vote because the Relenthi valued accuracy above alliance, and the evidence summary had been inaccurate by omission. Their senior delegate, an ancient, thin-limbed archivist named Sarath, looked at the tally with an expression that in Relenthi culture carried a specific meaning. The look of a scholar who has cited a source without reading the primary document. It was, in Relenthi terms, a profound professional shame. 562. On the Kelishari tier, the minor faction that had closed their consoles during the silence, all 8 delegates reopened their screens and changed their votes. They had been part of the Vorathi trade bloc for 11 years. They would not be part of it tomorrow. The trade corridor processing times would lengthen. The convoy schedules would shift. They knew this. They voted against anyway, because of the question the human delegate had asked. Why does this institution exist? Had reached the place inside them where pragmatism ended and something older began. 554. Minor factions began switching. The Kosven, the Drathani, the Selori, the Thenar Collective, small delegations with limited voting weight, each change moving the tally by 2 or 3 or 4 votes. But the cumulative effect was visible in the cyan numbers above the chamber floor, which were now falling at a rate that transformed the mood on the upper tiers from confidence to unease, to something approaching alarm. 541, 519, 502. On the Calenthi tier, the arbiter's own species delegation, which by tradition abstained on matters where the arbiter had a presiding role, a quiet, unprecedented discussion was taking place. 3 Calenthi delegates were debating whether to break tradition and cast votes. Their horizontal pupils tracked between the tally numbers and Velis Koth's face, reading both. 2 of them changed from abstain to oppose. The third followed 30 seconds later. The tradition held less weight than the question. On the upper tiers, delegations that had been locked in by Vorathi trade relationships began recalculating. The political mathematics of the chamber were shifting beneath them. Voting with the Vorathi on a resolution that was going to pass was one thing. Voting with the Vorathi on a resolution that was visibly collapsing was another. Trade corridor access mattered less when the access came from a patron whose evidence had just been publicly dismantled. 489, 463. The drosh stopped their clicking. 14 multifaceted eyes reflected the tally numbers in fractured repetition. Their senior delegate made a single gesture, a lifting of one chitinous forelimb, and all 14 voted against in unison. The tally dropped by 14 in a single chime. 449. Yaron Shah watched the numbers fall. He had spent 4 years building this coalition. 4 years of quiet meetings in private suites. 4 years of curated briefings and timed notifications and managed objections. The most meticulous political operation the Vorathi hegemony had undertaken in a generation, and it was coming apart in minutes, not because of a counterargument, not because of new evidence, not because of a procedural maneuver. Because a woman in a plain coat had walked through the doors and asked the room why it existed. The tally crossed below the simple majority threshold at 431, 22 minutes after Lena Vasic had walked through the main doors. It continued falling. Delegates who had been in favor were not simply abstaining, they were voting against. The condemnation motion was not failing by narrow margin. It was being repudiated. 372, 314, 281. When the voting period closed, the final numbers hung in cyan above the chamber floor. 214 in favor, 368 opposed, 80 abstaining. The motion to condemn Earth as a category, one aggressor state, failed by a margin that the Sovereign Compact's archivists would later describe as historically decisive. Not since the founding era had a motion carrying 600 preliminary votes collapsed to 200 in a single session. Arbiter Velis Koth looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she looked at Lena Vasic, who was still standing on the speaking floor, still in the same position, still with her hands at her sides and her flat shoes planted on alien stone. "The motion is defeated," Velis said. "The assembly will enter a 72-hour recess." She paused. The next words were not scripted. They were not in the procedural guidelines. They came from the 42 cycles she had spent presiding over an institution she had loved in the way that institutions are loved, imperfectly, frustratedly, with the full knowledge of their failures. During that recess, I am invoking Article 19 to convene an independent review of the Joint Security Directorate's evidence compilation procedures. The Vorathi tier went rigid. Additionally, I am referring the question of inspection team composition at Outpost Karena to the Neutrality Standards Board for formal audit. Article 19 reviews were rare, 3 in the Assembly's 470-year history. They were thorough, public, and impossible to bury. The last one had resulted in the dissolution of an entire directorate and the censure of 2 member states. Yaron Shah closed his console. The screen went dark. Around him, the Vorathi delegation sat in the stillness of political professionals who understood, with absolute clarity, that the next several months would be spent answering questions, They had designed this entire proceeding to ensure would never be asked. On the holographic displays lining the chamber walls, the archive tally numbers replaced the agenda items: 214, 368, 80, and the archival timestamp began running. In the technical booths behind the upper tiers, the assembly's recording staff, 6 lengthy technicians who had spent 11 hours documenting the proceedings, flagged the session for priority archival. One of them, a junior technician who had been in the role for 3 years and had never flagged anything, looked at the margin and then looked at the speaking floor where the human woman still stood and began composing a message to her sister that read, "Something happened here today that I do not fully understand yet, but I think it was important." On the Vorathi tier, Yaren Shah's deputy, a younger delegate named Tessara, was already calculating the damage. The Article 19 review would require full disclosure of the Directorate's evidence compilation methodology. The neutrality standards audit would expose the inspection team composition. The territorial reclamation claim on the Karena system, 14 years of careful positioning, would be re-examined under a lens that had not existed 20 minutes ago. She did not say any of this to Yaren. She did not need to. The mathematics of political collapse were as legible to the Vorathi as the mathematics of coalition building, and they were reading the same equation in reverse. Lena Vasic turned and walked back up the central aisle. She did not look at the Vorathi tier. She did not look at the Thessari or the Oranchi or the Makari. She walked the way she had entered, steady, unhurried, alone. The light from the dome fell on her from above, the same pale lavender daylight that had illuminated her speech, and it followed her up the aisle like a spotlight that the chamber's architects had never intended, but the physics of glass and angle had provided anyway. Halfway up the aisle, Sivi of the Oranchi stepped out of her tier and fell into step beside her. She did not speak. She simply walked alongside the human for 20 paces, her chromatophores cycling through a slow, deep spectrum that Lena could not read but understood. The color of someone saying, "I should have been the one to say it. I should have said it weeks ago." Sivi stopped at the boundary of her tier and returned to her seat. Lena continued alone. At the main doors, she paused not for effect, but because the doors were heavy and she needed to brace her shoulder against the titanium alloy to push them open. No one had designed this chamber for human proportions. No one had designed this institution for human participation. The chairs were too tall, the air too thin, the light wrong. The corridor beyond was quiet. Station light, flat, institutional without color or warmth. Recycled air that tasted of ozone and cleaning compounds. The hum of environmental systems doing the constant, invisible work of keeping 1,000 beings alive in a structure floating in vacuum. A cleaning drone drifted past at ankle height, its sensors registering her presence and adjusting its path. The only entity on the station that had responded to her arrival without political calculation. Through the corridor's narrow viewport, a horizontal strip of reinforced glass that most delegates walked past without glancing at, the station's exterior was visible, docking arms extending into space, the curved hull of the main structure, and beyond it the planet the station orbited. A pale world with lavender cloud cover, uninhabited, chosen as the assembly's home specifically because no species could claim it. Neutral ground, the geography of compromise. Beyond the planet, barely visible against the star-scattered dark, the Terran frigate held station. Its running lights blinked in the same steady pattern they had maintained for 6 days, the patient, unhurried rhythm of a vessel that had been sent not to threaten but to witness. Lena had not mentioned the ship in her speech. She had not needed to. Its presence said what speeches could not. We are here, we are watching, and we are not going anywhere. Lena leaned against the wall. The metal was cold against her shoulder blades. She closed her eyes and breathed, not the careful, measured inhalation she had maintained in the thin council air, but the deep, full-lunged breathing of a human body finally taking in oxygen the way it was meant to. The station's atmosphere was richer in the corridors than in the chamber, slightly warmer, slightly more humid, calibrated for the comfort of the administrative staff rather than the delegates. It was still not right. It was still not Earth air, but it was closer, and her lungs accepted it gratefully. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking since she walked through the doors. She had kept them at her sides and let them shake where no one could see, because the work required stillness, and the stillness was the point, and the shaking was just the body's honest response to what it cost. Footsteps in the corridor. She opened her eyes. A Calenthy aide, young, narrow-faced, wearing the pale gray tunic of the Arbiter's staff, stood 3 meters away, holding a data tablet. Delegate Vasic, Arbiter Koth requests your attendance at a preliminary consultation regarding the Article 19 review, at your convenience. Lena looked at the aide, at the tablet, at the corridor stretching away in both directions, identical and featureless. How far is the consultation room? 12 minutes by transit corridor. I will walk, I need the air. She pushed off the wall. In the transit corridor, Kale Dorath of the Thessari caught up to her and matched her pace. Tall, translucent skin showing the faint blue tracery of veins, his expression carrying the Thessari equivalent of discomfort, a tightening around the eyes, a deliberate stillness of the jaw. The 12 joint exercises, he said. I should have raised that in the evidentiary hearings. We had the records, we said nothing. You are raising it now. After the fact. The fact has not changed, Lena said. The response to it has. That is all any of us can do, respond honestly when we finally understand what is being asked. They walked together for 30 paces, different stride lengths, different species, different ways of moving through a corridor that belonged to neither of them. The transit corridor was long and featureless station architecture designed for function, not comfort, its walls lined with directional markers in 6 scripts, and its ceiling fitted with the soft, even lighting panels that gave every corridor on the station the same timeless, placeless quality. It could have been any hour. It could have been any day. The work happened in rooms like this regardless. The preliminary tally was 612, Kale said. My delegation contributed 9 of those votes. Lena did not respond. She let the statement exist in the corridor air, unadorned and uncontested, because the Thessari were a species that valued factual accountability, and Kale Dorath was holding himself accountable, and the most respectful thing she could do was let him. We trusted the directorate's summary, he said. We should have read the primary sources. You will now, Lena said. That matters more than the sequence. He considered this. The Thessari were not a species that accepted absolution easily. Their culture was built on the principle that an error unexamined was an error repeated. He would carry the weight of those 9 votes for a long time, not as guilt, which the Thessari considered an indulgent emotion, but as data, which they considered sacred. My delegation will co-sponsor the Article 19 review, Kale said. Good, Lena said. He stopped. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of his footsteps reversing direction, a Thessari returning to his delegation to begin the work of examining how 9 pragmatists had voted to condemn a species without reading the primary sources. It would not be a comfortable conversation. The Thessari did not have comfortable conversations about errors. They had thorough ones. The consultation room was small, windowless, furnished with the universal aesthetic of intergovernmental meeting spaces. A brushed steel table, chairs scaled for multiple species, a holographic display showing the assembly's procedural architecture rotating slowly in cyan wire frame. Arbiter Velis Koth was already seated. She looked at Lena with unblinking horizontal pupils. You almost did not make it, Velis said. I almost did not, Lena agreed. She sat in a chair that was 6 centimeters too tall, her feet not quite touching the floor, and placed her hands flat on the table. The evidence review will take months, Velis said. The neutrality standards audit of Karena will take longer. The Vorathi will challenge every step. They will cite jurisdictional limits, confidentiality protocols, sovereign prerogative. Yes. And the 309 deployments will be re-examined with full context. The narrative will change. It already has, Lena said. Velis studied her. The horizontal pupils moved slowly, left to right. You could have presented counter-evidence, Velis said. Data logs, deployment records, time-stamped notifications. A forensic dismantling of the summary, item by item. It would have been what any trained advocate would have done. It would have been a legal argument, Lena said. Legal arguments win votes by narrow margins. They change the count. They do not change the counting. And you needed to change the counting. The body needed to change how it counts, Lena said. I just reminded it that the question existed. Velis was quiet. Outside the room, the station hummed with the low-frequency vibration of a structure built to house a government. The founding charter, Velis said. The first clause, I wrote my dissertation on it 46 years ago. I read your dissertation on the transit here, Lena said. It was the best thing written about this institution's purpose. Something shifted in Velis's expression. Not a smile, lengthy faces did not move that way. A change in the angle of her jaw, a slight softening of the rigid line of her shoulders. The closest her physiology came to the expression of someone who had been seen clearly after a very long time of being invisible. I will ensure you are included in the review proceedings, Velis said, not as a witness, as a consultant. Thank you, Lena said. She sat in the oversized chair with her feet not quite reaching the floor, in a windowless room on a station orbiting a world that was not hers, in an institution that had tried to condemn her species 3 hours ago, and she felt the specific, unremarkable exhaustion of someone who had done the work and would do it again tomorrow, and the day after that and the day after that, because the work was never finished, and the rooms were always cold, and the chairs were always the wrong size. In the chamber, the session had formally ended. Delegates filed out through the lower-tier exits, some talking in low voices, some composing messages to their home governments. The tally had been archived, 214 to 368. The archivists had already flagged the margin. On the Vorathi tier, Yaron Shal was the last to leave. He stood slowly, crimson robes heavy on his shoulders, and looked down at the empty speaking floor where a woman in a plain coat had dismantled 4 years of careful work in 7 minutes. He did not understand it. He had the votes. He had the evidence. He had the procedural architecture. He had controlled the timing, the notification, the inspection teams. He had built a machine designed to produce a specific outcome, and the machine had worked exactly as designed, right up until a single variable he had not accounted for walked through the main doors. The variable was not the evidence. The evidence had been in the registry all along. The variable was not the procedure. Section 4 had been in the charter for 470 years. The variable was that someone had walked into a room full of people who had forgotten why the room was built, and reminded them. He left the chamber. The doors closed behind him with the low resonance of titanium on titanium. The dome's pale daylight fell on empty tiers, silent consoles, and the fading cyan ghost of a tally that had meant everything an hour ago, and would mean something else entirely by morning. In the consultation room, 12 minutes away by transit corridor, Lena Vasic was already working on the next phase. The evidence review, the audit frameworks, the procedural motions to be filed, responded to, challenged, refiled. The slow, unglamorous mechanics of accountability, committee meetings, document reviews, late-night revisions to submissions that would be read by 3 people and would matter enormously. She would be here for months. She had packed for it. The chair was too tall, the air was too thin, the light was wrong. She worked anyway.